population was concentrated because the hills that make the city remarkable were not able to easily be climbed or scaled by people. And so people settled down in the basin, in the region closest to the river. And then it was not until technology moved forward, until the creation of the locomotive and the cable car that enabled people to navigate the hills with greater ease, that people began to move up and into areas that we now know as Mount Auburn or Avondale or all the way out into Mount Airy, that these areas began to be populated as people were able to navigate the hills. But before that, what you had was people were lived in very densely populated areas, regardless of race or regardless of class, that everybody lived in the same region. Now, there was some segregation that happened even in this densely populated area. We know history tells us that African Americans lived in what is now the West End and what was once Kenyon Bar, which was completely eradicated, and now parts of Kenyon Bar are in a neighborhood called Queensgate. And so we know that there was some segregation that happened, but everybody lived within sight of one another. People lived closer together. The rich and the poor lived closer together. Employees lived close to the people that they employed. Elected officials lived close to the people who they were supposed to represent. The people who were tasked with keeping law and order lived among the people for whom they were keeping law and order. Everybody lived closer together. But as technology enabled people to move further, some people were able to move further sooner. And then neighborhoods began to be created. Neighborhoods which began to create a division in the city, a division that has lasted for decades upon decades. Avondale was a marker of one of these neighborhoods. Avondale, the community that we are in now, originally was not an African American community, it was a Jewish community. And so this is where Jewish people came and settled in a community where they would be a little freer from the daily hassles of discrimination that happened in broader sectors. They built institutions here. Many of the houses of worship that are now occupied by black churches were once Jewish synagogues here in this space. There were other communities that were built. Some of them were built with the idea of keeping people out. With the idea of only letting a certain group of people in. And we see some of the vestiges of that. What we have now in the city is we have Hyde Park. Hyde Park is a neighborhood that largely has a certain, not just a certain economic group, but a certain class of economic group lives in Hyde Park. That Hyde Park is referred to as old money. That many of the people who own houses in Hyde Park are people who have generational wealth in the city. And people who have newer wealth tend to either live places out west or in Indian Hill. Neighborhoods have their own classification, and people who live in them, by and large, not universally, but by and large, neighborhoods in Cincinnati have a descriptor about them in a way of creating separation. It's why that people talk about Cincinnati as a city that operates in silos, that it is possible to grow up on the east side of Cincinnati and rarely, if ever, venture over to the west side, or to grow up on the west side of Cincinnati and rarely, if ever, venture over to the east side. That for a city as geographically small and that has a population as small as we have, it is easy to be in your part of the city and not venture to the other part. Now, this is not unique to Cincinnati. This happens in city across city around the United States. In multiple cities I've been, I have encountered people who not only have not left their city, but have not left their neighborhood. In a city as large as New York, with as much as there is to do, and with the ease of public transportation, of being able to get on a subway and get from one end of the city to the other, There are people who live in boroughs of New York.
Yeah.
People who grew up in Brooklyn who don't leave Brooklyn. Who never venture into Manhattan or Queens or any other, that another neighborhood in New York might as well be another city or another country to them, because they have not left their neighborhoods. That there are people who stay in places where they are. These divisions, these names that we give to places create divisions that seem for some people to lock them in. My brothers and sisters, one of the things that I love about being black, one of the things that I love about our black culture is that it is not a culture of isolation, but it is a culture of communalism. It is a part of our value system, our ethos. It's why there are so many of the principles of Kwanzaa that promote togetherness. It's why we start Kwanzaa with celebrating the principle of unity. It is why, as a part of Kwanzaa, we talk about cooperative work and responsibility, that the task of communal liberation is not any individuals alone, but it is the work that we do together. It's why we have a day that talks about cooperative economics, that we resist the notion of me pulling myself up by my own bootstraps. It is a collective effort that we do better when we all work together. These principles of unity and cooperation are embedded in the values that we have. Which is not to say that we always live them out perfectly. It's not to say that we live them out without fault, or we do not have challenges. It's not to say that at times we do not have contradictions between the values we proclaim and the way we actually show up. But like everyone else in the United States, that we wrestle with the impact of white supremacy on our culture and on our daily lives. That we wrestle with a culture that tells us that prosperity equals separation. That in order to get ahead, it means you have to move out of certain neighborhoods or certain regions, that you have to separate yourself, that you have to create distance between yourself and others in order to have the appearance of success. It is a culture that values people at early ages in their life, before they are fully financially independent, leaving their parents' house and often taking on financial burdens that they are ill-equipped to be able to handle, because this is what it looks like to be an adult. Rather than staying and building wealth, rather than creating ways, finding ways of renegotiating a relationship within a household that allows for more responsibility and allows for more freedom, that so often there is a call to quickly divide in the name of responsibility, in the name of progress. These myths of what success look like permeate our culture. We hear it. I don't know if you've heard, but already I'm starting to hear ads for Mike Bloomberg as he's running for the president of the United States. And with all of the money he has, if he isn't doing anything else, he's buying ad space everywhere. Because every basketball game I watch, every podcast I listen to, he's got an ad talking about how he was a middle-class person who lost his job at 39, but created a computer and then created another computer and sold those computers and built a team, and now he's a billionaire, and now he wants to run for president. And in that story, he neglects to talk about, he neglects to tell the full story. He tells the story as if it's his singular genius, because this is the story America wants to hear. The story of people who are singularly genius, who are singularly smart, who are singularly driven to rise up above the circumstances. But we don't often talk about the impact of family wealth and how family wealth makes it possible for some people to survive getting fired easier than other people to survive getting fired. We don't talk about the ways that communities provide support systems, and that some people have a network where they are easily able to get people to invest in their ideas. And some people are trying to create their own ideas while working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. We don't talk about the fact that some people are able to leverage networks that they've created because their families have put them in the finest academic institutions. And so they're able to leverage those networks to be able to help them to achieve success, while other people are trying to achieve success, while everyone else in their network is also struggling trying to achieve success. We don't talk about how unequal the opportunities that people have are.
Amen.
And so to expect everyone to be a Mike Bloomberg or to shame people because they have not taken their ideas and made multi-millions of dollars is not realistic. It's a myth. We have taken an American dream and created a fiction around it and presented it to people. And that fictionalized dream often impacts and it influences the way that we experience the communal nature of our community, and it challenges us. And we are always caught, as W.E. Du Bois said, that to be black in America is to be caught between the pull of blackness and the pull of whiteness and try not to be torn asunder. This is a community struggle that we engage in regularly. But friends and family, I want to tell you that this struggle is not unique to us. It manifests for us in a particular way in America, but we are not the only people in history who have experienced a similar struggle. But Jesus, in the community that Jesus is born into, is experiencing a similar struggle in their time. Jesus and the people of Israel in this time under Roman occupation, even though they are living in the land of their ancestors, even though they are living in the land of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, even though they're able to walk the roads that David walked and see the places where Jeremiah preached, even though they are in that land, they are not able to show up in that land as their full selves. Because Rome is a very oppressive government. Rome is trying to build an empire. Rome is trying to control and dictate what is happening not just in their region among their people, but what is happening all around the world. Rome sets up military outposts in other places so that if a riot breaks out, their soldiers can quickly dispatch and quell any uprising that threatens Rome's sovereignty. Rome is trying to take over as much of the world as they can get their hands on. And you cannot take over the world and allow people to be their full selves. It's a fact, my brothers and sisters, that in order to have that level of control and domination, that you have to get people to fall in line. People have to play out prescribed parts. They have to act in ways that support the ongoing growth of the empire, and they're not allowed to be themselves. And so this is what's happening. This is what is happening in the time that Jesus is born and working. And so many of Jesus's teachings and parables, the work that Jesus is doing is calling people not just to connect with God on a religious and spiritual level, but to reject the oppression that is forced on them by Rome, that has been co-signed by a religious system that has made a compromise in order to continue to exist. That the worship that happened in the temple was not the radical worship that invited Moses to go and challenge Pharaoh. It's not the radical worship that inspired Daniel to speak up to King Nebuchadnezzar. That it was a compromised worship. It was a worship that was in line with the Roman supremacy that happened, that was occurring at the time. And so counter to that, Jesus is trying to teach ways how we can reconnect. And this is, in that spirit is where this parable emerges. The scripture says a lawyer comes to Jesus to try to test Jesus because this lawyer had grown up, was educated in this system. And so the lawyer was profiting off of the system. The system was working for the lawyer. The lawyer did not want the system to be challenged because to challenge the system means that you were challenging how they made their living. So this lawyer is trying to trap Jesus, to try to get Jesus to stop preaching these radical messages. And so the lawyer says, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus, understanding the argument that he is about to get into, chooses to bypass the argument and turns the question back on the lawyer and says, what do you see is the greatest commandment? And the lawyer says, well, to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. These are the two greatest. And Jesus says, yes, that's right. And so the lawyer does not look stupid. He extends the conversation and says, but who is my neighbor? So Jesus takes this opportunity, friends and family, not to create narrow parameters around who the neighbor is. Jesus doesn't try to build a wall around who we can call neighbors, my brothers and sisters. But Jesus takes this opportunity to lift up this parable to challenge what we think of as neighbors. In other words, Jesus uses this parable as a way of saying to the lawyer and all who would listen and by faith to us today, come get a little closer. Jesus tells this parable. There are three things I want to lift up in this parable to help us to get a little closer. The first thing I want to lift up that Jesus does is Jesus calls us in this parable to move past these artificial barriers that are designed to keep us separate. This parable, as you may know, hinges on a relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans. The reason this parable is called the Good Samaritan is because that would be seen as an oxymoron in that time. They did not believe that there were good Samaritans. The Jews and the Samaritans had a beef between them, kind of like the Bloods and the Crips, or like the Yankees and the Red Sox, or the Bengals and the Steelers. That there is a deep-seated division between the Jews and the Samaritans. They did not take kindly to one another. That the most devout Jewish people, when traveling from one side of the region to the other, would rather walk all the way around Samaria than to be seen crossing through it, because they would not want to defile themselves by walking in the land, in the country of the Samaritans. And so would rather add a week's journey around to their trip in order to avoid being seen walking through Samaria. You may remember the conversation that Jesus has with the woman at the well, where she finds out that Jesus is a religious leader, and so she asks a religious question. You Jews say the temple is where you should worship. The Samaritans say the mountains is where we should worship. Where is the place we ought to worship? They had such basic disagreements with everything in their religious and collective lives. But they were essentially the same people. Who the Samaritans were historically, friends and family, is that they were descendants of Abraham as well. Not only were they descendants of Abraham, but they were not the descendants of Abraham that were the offshoots because of Abraham's first son, Ishmael, but they were also descendants of Isaac. And they were descendants of Isaac through Jacob. They were part of the original 12 tribes. And somewhere as the nations continued to grow, the Samaritans were the most vulnerable to the outside pressures. If you remember the history of Israel, there is a time when the northern kingdom falls. When the kingdom splits in two and the northern kingdom falls, in the southern kingdom, the two tribes in the south stay intact. That northern kingdom that fell is where the Samaritans lived. And while they were under foreign occupation for a much longer extended period of time than the south ever was, they began to marry with others in order to help preserve their way of life. In order to be able to survive, they married with others. in order to build a more sustainable future. But in marrying with others, they kept their religious beliefs.
Yes.
They kept their belief in Yahweh. They did not worship gods that asked them to do things like sacrifice children in order to worship or to commit other atrocities. They kept their belief in God and Yahweh who freed people from liberation. And so the difference, my brothers and sisters, between them was not that great. And especially when you consider the fact that Rome was an outsider to both of them, and Rome didn't care for Samaritans or Jews.
Yeah, speak that word.
Yeah.
But they allowed this division to persist. And whereas they might have been a stronger force had they banded together, they were not able to reach their collective strength because of the made-up division that kept them separated. Jesus, the first thing I want to say Jesus is saying in this parable is to reach past these made-up divisions. To accentuate the point, Jesus says there is a priest who walks by and a Levite who walks by. These two religious figures, people who should be the embodiments of God's grace and mercy, the people who should see someone in need and stop and try to help that person pass by and ignore the pain of the person because they have been so conditioned to see the divisions between themselves and others that they do not see this person who is their own kindred by the side of the road as somebody they should stop and help. In other words, friends and family, what I'm saying is that the same mindset that made it possible for them to think of Samaritans as being someone else is the same mindset that enabled them to think of this brother laying by the side of the road as somebody not worth helping. That when we allow these made-up divisions to infect our minds and impact the way we live, it negates our ability to see one another as family. It's why, friends and family, it's why there are too many churches that look down at people when they walk in the doors or make assumptions about people who walk in the doors based on how they dress or how they look, based on outward images. They make perceptions about who the person is on the inside. Even though when Samuel tried to do that, God corrected Samuel. And said that God does not look on the outside, but God looks at the heart. But there are too many churches that forget that because we have allowed the divisions that other people have tried to place on us to be internalized by us, and we perpetuate that on one another. We perpetuate images of what righteousness ought to look like or what holiness ought to look like. We perpetuate these images and then we put people into groups. We categorize people. We box them in and define them by things that have nothing to do with who they are. We allow the divisions to separate us from one another, and it makes us weaker. It makes us less effective. It disconnects us from our faith. We miss what God is calling us to do, like this priest who goes to the temple thinking he's honoring God, but missing what God is calling him to do just in this moment. There was a study done on a seminary based on this theme. They told seminarians to prepare to preach a sermon on the Good Samaritan. And so they told the seminarian where to show up to preach. And then at the last minute, once the seminarian showed up there, they went to that place and they said, we had to change the venue. And we are having the service somewhere across campus. And for half of the people, they said, it's somewhere across campus and it's starting right now. We got to get you there in a hurry. And for the other half of the people, they said, it's starting across campus, but we got about 15 minutes to get there. And on the way, they had somebody who was clearly audibly in distress. And seminarians, people who were training to be preachers, while getting ready to preach on the Good Samaritan, crossed paths with somebody who was in distress. And the test was to see whether or not they would stop to help the person. And half of them did not stop while going to preach on the Good Samaritan. And what they said, the difference was whether or not they felt like they were in a rush. The people who felt like they had enough time, who felt like they could walk leisurely, that had a few minutes to spare, stopped to help and see about the person in distress. The people who felt like they were in a rush could not be bothered to stop and help the person because they had to go preach a sermon about helping people. How many times, friends and family, brothers and sisters, do we in our hurry to try to do things that we think God would want us to do we ignore the people who God is placing right in front of us? Do we ignore the work that God is really calling us to do? Jesus is calling us to move past the barriers that are designed to keep us separate. This is what Jesus did in Jesus' life. Lepers were a group of people who were supposed to be separate. Nobody's supposed to go near them, and you definitely can't touch them or else you will become unclean. But I see Jesus there, not just engaging in conversation, but daring to touch a leper because Jesus believed that the cleanness inside of Jesus would impact the leper more than the uncleanness of the leper would impact Jesus. And so Jesus goes past the barrier to touch the leper. I hear Jesus talking to a woman who had an issue of blood because even though society put labels around her and said that by the fact that she was a woman, she couldn't even come into the temple, and by the fact that she was unclean, she couldn't be around in public space. But Jesus stops on his way to go heal somebody else, to have a conversation with her so that she knows and everyone around her knows that God has chosen this moment to reach into her life because she is seen as being worthy of God's presence. Jesus, time and time again, goes and breaks the barriers that are designed to keep people separate. The second thing that Jesus says in this parable is that we are called to make a sacrifice on behalf of one another. When this Samaritan on his journey, he says the first thing he does is he makes a sacrifice of time. He stops whatever he is doing, wherever he is going. He stops to see about this man. But not only does he see about them, but he uses the resources that he has, the oil, the water that are a part of his resources. He uses his own resource to help this man.
Praise God.
He uses what he has. I just believe, friends and family, that when he packed at the beginning of his journey, that he was not packing oil and water just in case I happen to come across somebody who's lying bleeding by the side of the road. But he had a purpose for which he had packed that. He packed that for his own use or for the use of the people where he was going. He had a purpose in mind, but when he saw a need, that need was elevated above his own personal use, and so he makes a sacrifice to help someone in need. God calls us, friends and family, to make individual and collective sacrifices to help the people who are in need, both present in our congregation and in the community around us. God calls us to make sacrifices in order to help one another. Friends and family, when Jesus' life was becoming politically difficult and he was hiding out in remote areas and avoiding major cities because he knew that death threats were coming, his good friend Lazarus died. And the disciples heard that Lazarus died, and they wanted to go be with Lazarus, but they were also worried. They were worried because they knew that people were looking for Jesus. And if you're looking for Jesus, a good place to find him would be at the funeral service of his best friend. But Jesus does not stay away from Lazarus' funeral in order to protect himself.
Yes.
But Jesus shows up there. He makes a sacrifice, knowing that it is going to put him on the road to his eventual crucifixion.
Yes.
He makes that sacrifice because Mary and Martha were in need.
Yes.
Jesus, when Jairus comes and Jairus' daughter is sick, Jairus has just been plotting to kill Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And now this person who's been plotting to kill Jesus comes to Jesus asking for help. Jesus knows that this plot is going around and knows that Jairus is one of the conspirators.
Yes.
And so Jesus could have easily ignored Jairus' request,
Yes.
because why would I help the daughter of somebody who is plotting to
Yes.
kill me?
Yes. Yes.
Particularly when the plotter is the one coming to ask
Yes,
me for
Lord.
help.
Yes, Lord.
But Jesus makes the sacrifice, friends and family, that he goes beyond what is seen as the reasonable call of duty. He
Yes.
extends himself to help someone who is in need.
Yes.
And so we are called to make sacrifices for one another. The last thing that I want to lift up in this parable is that Jesus calls us to view one another, and particularly those who are in need, as family. Look at what this man does. If he had simply poured oil and bandaged up his wounds and left him at the side of the road, what he did would have been more than he had to do. But he goes beyond that. He lifts the man up and puts him on his own animal. He goes to an inn that he was not planning to stop at himself.
Yes.
He spends the night taking care of the man.
Yes.
And then when he leaves, he pays the innkeeper to take extra care of him.
Mm-hmm.
He treats this man as if he was treating somebody who was precious to him.
Yes.
We would not be surprised if somebody did this for a loved one, if somebody did this for a mother, father, son, daughter, grandmother, aunt, uncle, godparent. We would not be surprised.
Yes.
But to do this for a stranger is surprise enough. But to do this for a political enemy is even greater.
Yes.
He treats this individual as if they are family. And that's what God calls us to do, friends and family, is to see one another as family. It is why when we come into the space to worship, that part of our worship is giving hugs to one another, greeting one another. We do that not just before worship, but in our worship to reinforce the fact that God is calling us to be family. It is why that we have seen it important to invest ourselves in the needs of our community to make sure that people have at least an option of a place to eat so they can have a hot meal, because that is how you treat your family. It is why that we make the investments of time and energy that we do, is because God calls us to see one another not as strangers, but to see one another as family. And I know these things are challenging. It can be hard. It's a lot to ask, and it's a lot to expect, friends and family, for us to be able to do those things, to look past differences, to make sacrifices on behalf of one another, and to treat one another as family. It is a lot to ask. But I want to simply lift up to you that the reason we are able to do that is because God does this for us.
Amen. 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 Yes.
That all throughout the scripture, friends and family, the Bible calls that God is calling people who are distant to come into the family.
Yes.
That God's family is not an exclusive family, friends and family, but it's always extending the boundaries.
Yes.
That Ruth, who was a Moabite, whose family was not part of the original 12 tribes, who had no blood kin, is brought into the family.
Yes.
That when David makes a move against Uriah, who is a Hittite, whose family had no connection to the people of Israel, God holds David accountable for how he treats Uriah, even though Uriah was an outsider, because he had an obligation to treat Uriah as family. That over and over again, God says to people, I am adopting you, I am calling you, even though you might not have a right to be be called my people. I am claiming you as my people because God treats us as family.
Yes.
In fact, God treated us family so much that the Bible says, one of the things we see the Bible saying is that God sends his own son,
Yes.
Jesus, to earth.
Yes.
As Don sang in the song, that Jesus doesn't sit from heaven and send us down a prescription to help us from heaven, but Jesus comes from heaven to earth to show us the way. And showing us the way, he showed us how to live with one another, how to love one another, how to feed those who are hungry, how to clothe those who needed clothes, how to visit those who were sick and in prison. Jesus showed us the way. When the system got tired of Jesus doing these revolutionary things among them and got tired of people walking with their heads up, who they needed to have their heads down, they tried to crucify Jesus. And Jesus did not run away, but went, as the songwriter said, from the earth to the cross. And there he hung on the cross as an enemy of the state. He hung on the cross as an outlaw. He hung on the cross bearing the shame of the legal system upon him. And when he had a chance to run, he would not run, but he stayed there on the cross. They took him off the cross. They put him in a tomb because he had no burial insurance. So they placed him in a borrowed tomb. But the Bible says that early Sunday morning, just about the break of day, Jesus got up with all power in his hands. And because Jesus got up, we can find strength, friends and family. We can find strength to go past these divisions. We can find strength to make sacrifices for one another. We can find strength to see one another as family. Because God has done it for us, we can do it for one another. We have a practice here at Beloved Community Church that we call response to the word. It's our way of acknowledging that God doesn't just seek to talk through me, but actually God is desiring to talk to and through each and every one of us. And so we take a moment to say, God, what is it that you are saying to me? How is it that this message intersects with or impacts my life? And then we don't just keep it to ourselves.
No.
Because we are a communal people. And so we share with one another what God is saying to us. Because it's in that sharing. It's in the speaking and in the listening that God is able to speak and to move. It's in that sharing, in the speaking and in listening, that we begin to see one another less as strangers and more as friends and family. And so I invite you to step into this practice as fully as you are able with us, to turn and find a friend or a neighbor. And my challenge is always to find at least one person in your group who you didn't come in with. One person in your group who you won't have a conversation with when you leave. Find somebody new to engage in conversation about what God is saying to you right now.